So the point then is that our ideas are powerfully shaped by culture, among other forces, and we can learn from other cultures then, from other modes of knowing. As we look across different societies, we're seeing different ways of viewing the land, of viewing the landscapes. And I think we all sense that. But before we can actually learn from other ways of seeing the land, of seeing our place in the land, we have to actually understand what those ways of seeing the land are. And I think to do that, we have to find some sort of sensible model to understand these, some way of conceptualizing them that goes beyond simplistic narratives. So there is sometimes a tendency to sort of paint with an extremely broad brush when talking about culture's views of the environment. So for example, to say that Western views of the environment, quote unquote, are more mechanistic, while indigenous ways of viewing the environment are more relational. And while there may be a lot of truth to some of those statements, I think it is much more helpful if we get specific about specific cultures and then build up to bigger patterns when we, I think, try to paint over, huge percentages of the population and boil it down to one or two phrases, such as mechanistic, such as sustainable, we, I think, miss a lot of the fine detail. And it's in the fine detail, I think, where we find some of the most interesting, important, enriching, and complex things that we can learn from other human beings across the world about how we approach the landscape, right? It's, as Clifford Geertz said, interpretive anthropology, as he said, is not about finding kind of ultimate laws of human behavior, but instead about seeing the answers that other people have given to the same questions we have faced. He said it slightly differently, but that was basically the idea. So that's the idea then, is how do we go beyond that and speak meaningfully about different knowledge systems? So we talked about one, which was social constructionism, and the way in which Rachel Carson sort of was able to move the needle, as it were, was to help shift a social construction of how pesticides were viewed within the US. Another model for understanding knowledge systems about the environment is what's called ethnoecology. So ethnoecology is actually one of the big three roots, I would say, of environmental anthropology. You sort of have cultural ecology from Julian Stewart starting in the 40s / 50s. You have ethnoecology also kind of starting in the 50s. And then you have political ecology starting really in the 70s. So ethnoecology then is a really early sort of model by which to understand how different cultures view the natural world. Ethnoecology, it's a pretty straightforward term and concept, although the actual application of it can be extremely complex and very, very technical. But to sort of boil it down into simple terms, it is the people's ecology, right, is the way that would literally translate ethno for people, ecology for ecology, right? And ecology comes from the Greek oikos, which is not just a Greek yogurt, but is also the term for surroundings, the home, the things which are around you. It's also the root word for economics, interestingly. So my point with that is ethnoecology then is a specific group, a specific people's views of that which surrounds them, of the environment in which they find themselves. And of course, it should be obvious from that in some people's ethnoecologies, there are elements that are not in others, both because they are in different environments, but also because they may see and envision agents within the environment that other groups do not, right? Some groups see spiritual entities in nature where other groups do not, for example. But the basic idea here, though, is a people's understanding of nature. And early ethnoecological work and ethnoecological work from really the 50s through the 90s, and to some degree still today, was really heavily focused on linguistic classification, of sort of charting out the categories by which a group conceptualizes the world, right? This idea that indigenous people, and as well as many other groups of people, have their own systematic, complex ways of categorizing the natural world, of identifying different plants and animals and weather and different things like that. That it is not only sort of laboratory scientists or scientists trained in sort of the Western model that are the ones that categorize the world or develop a way of understanding ecosystems, but instead that each society develops ways of categorizing its natural world and of describing ecological interactions, and that's called ethnoecology. And indeed, decades of research has shown us that there aren't really groups that don't do that, right? Groups develop ways of categorizing the animals and plants around them, and we can observe interesting trends in how they do that. By the way, ethnoecology is kind of a part of a bigger trend that we call ethnosciences, which has a lot of different branches. So for example, ethnobotany kind of goes alongside ethnoecology, specifically people's understandings of plants and often of medicinal plants. Ethnomedicine, ethnopharmacology, which the study of local people's understandings of health, the understanding of local people's knowledge about medicinal plants. That's a somewhat complex issue as well, and sometimes controversial. There's the topic of bioprospecting, but basically within the Amazon and other tropical rainforests, there's a tremendous amount of plant diversity that indigenous peoples understand oftentimes a lot better than outsider scientists, and you have sometimes pharmaceutical companies that in the 90s, the 2000s, I think still to this day, have paid people to go down and learn from indigenous people about medicinal plant knowledge and then develop that into drugs, into medicines. That is sometimes done with consent from the group, in which case I think most people wouldn't have a problem with it and instead see it as a really good thing, moving medicinal plants into a domain where they can be used by a broader market as long as it's done sustainably. But sometimes it is done without consent of the people involved, which then raises rather thorny questions, one of which is sustainable harvesting of a plant, but a bigger question being sort of who owns cultural knowledge, which is a really complex question I'm not going to kind of get into right now because that's not the main point of this lecture, but it's an interesting question, an important question, and really a critical question actually. But ethnoecology then is going out to a group of people, asking them about the ways in which they categorize the world. Early on, it tended to heavily focus then on language, on linguistic classifications, on sort of, okay, we're going to look at different plants together as we move around the forest, and you're going to, and please would you identify the terms that this has in your own language, and then the ethnoecologist, the anthropologist or geographer, whatever it would be, would come home, write up the paper, and have these like tables of like, well, here's the term in sort of classic scientific description, the Linnaean taxonomy, Canis lupus for wolf as one simple example. Here's the term in that culture, right? And usually here's the common term in English or the common term in Spanish if you're writing in Spanish or whatever the case may be. So a good example of this kind of work is from one of the people that really developed ethnoecology. So Harold Conklin, who was an anthropologist working in the 50s. He was always really interested in cultural diversity. He ended up serving in the military in the Philippines, and then after his tour of service, kind of staying on for a couple of years, partly with financial support from University of Berkeley. And then eventually that morphed into him getting a doctorate in anthropology and doing a really serious long-term multi-year study of horticulture in the Philippines as practiced by Hanunoo-speaking people, or Hanunoo people as he was calling them, or Mangyan people as we would probably say now, who are found on this island of Minono down here. Anyways, Minoru, sorry. Harold Conklin had an interesting way of doing things and of saying things and of doing his research. There's a great story with him and Clifford Geertz, who's another famous anthropologist. And Clifford Geertz did all sorts of different things, which is why he's more famous than Harold Conklin. But he was at the time studying agriculture in Southeast Asia as well. And Harold Conklin paid him a visit at his field site. And he started asking Clifford Geertz all these questions, like to tell him about like the bamboo, so the specific bamboo plants that the fences were made out of, and specific types of objects in the bazaar where people were selling things, and like wanting to know all these like technical, very like nitty-gritty physical details about the field site. Whereas like Clifford Geertz is more of like this ideas guy, especially as his career progressed. And so then Harold Conklin apparently was just like, okay, no, it's okay. When Geertz like couldn't answer anything of these details, and he's like, I'll take care of it. And so then he left Geertz's home, and then he came back in the evening, and he'd drawn up this like super detailed map of the community of like the bazaar and stuff like that. He was just this like obsessively detailed dude that like just like dwelled in the details and loved the details. And it allowed him to do good work. So one of the things that he did though was study Mangyan horticulture, slash and burn horticulture, Swidden horticulture. And one of the things at the time, it was a very widespread notion, including among people that worked in the new field of international development, new in the 1950s. There was this widespread notion that indigenous Swidden practices slash and burn horticulture was inefficient, wasteful, illogical, irrational, just didn't make any sense, used up the soil washed away, it was wasteful, and that it would lead to forest being destroyed forever and instead receding into grassland, which itself is kind of a reflection of a Western social construction of forest is better than grassland, which is a story for another day. But anyways, Swidden is sort of this irrational thing. Harold Conklin for a lot of years was the main voice in sort of the international development world and the social science world, really pushing back on that and saying not so fast. He did extensive research with this group, among others, to suggest, you know, people are very deliberate with how they do Swidden horticulture. There's a series of phases to it of when you fallow, when you cut the trees down, when you burn them, how long you do this, how you plant, when you harvest. It's all very methodical. It doesn't have to be the way sort of an industrial agricultural farmer in the US would do it, to be very methodical and very precise, and people have a mental map in their head of exactly how they go about the different stages and exactly when you need to do it to be the most efficient. He also pointed out that the areas of land that outsiders were thinking of as like, oh, they've messed up the landscape with their slash and burn and turned it into a grassland instead of a forest, and this like swordgrass that nobody wants. Harold Conklin pointed out actually that swordgrass is very economically useful to Mangyan people, and they use it for things, and also that there's a lot of other environmental factors other than horticulture that leads to grasslands in the first place. So basically, he said this in the most nerdy, technologically specific, detailed, just the facts way possible, but he was basically saying to the international development world, back off horticulturalists, they know what they're doing. Back off slash and burn, they know what they're doing, or at least in some cultures they very much know what they're doing, and this is a methodical process that deserves to be respected in its own right. As one person pointed out, you know, he spends 15 pages describing this type of farming, and even though he never comes out and says it, part of the point he's making, and part of the point that a lot of ethnoecologists were making early on, is that indigenous peoples and non-Western peoples' way of doing things, way of understanding the environment, by presenting them as worthy of study, worthy of pages, in the same way that other agricultural methods were, they were implicitly trying to put indigenous and other ways of using the land on par with sort of Western ways, and saying these are legitimate systems, fact-based, knowledgeable, effective systems of using the land in their own right that deserve to be studied in their own merits and not just treated as sort of inferior versions of what Western farmers are up to, or what Western scientists are finding in nature. That indigenous people had systems of knowing the land every bit as complex, detailed, and methodical, and ways of using it every bit as methodical and careful as anybody else. At the time, nowadays that seems pretty obvious. At the time, that was quite radical, and so to the sort of Western policymakers. And so Conklin's work was really interesting in that way. He also did a lot of work on how people categorize the environment. For example, he found out that within Mangyan communities, which is a community of about 300,000 people in the Philippines, I don't know what it would have been in the 50s, but that there were 1,625 different terminology for plants. So I want you to pause the video and write down every single plant term you can think of, and it has to be a plant within your environment. You can't be thinking about like stuff half a world away. It has to be stuff right here in Alaska. And give me 1,600 terms. I'm guessing you probably can't. I can't either. And the point isn't that any Mangyan person could, but that people could give hundreds upon hundreds, and that taken together you had well over 1,500 different plant terminologies. These were not people who had a poor understanding of their environment. If anything, they had a much more detailed, much more precise and specific vocabulary to understand their environment than outsider scientists who had only spent a few years studying the same ecosystem. He also found that that vocabulary was very much keyed into how people used the landscape, and that 93% of the species he identified, the different terms people had for these different plant species, had cultural relevance, meaning people had some kind of a use for that plant, or some kind of teaching about it, or something like that. So think about that. Think about the amount of plants you interact with on a daily basis. Really try to think, not just the fruit you eat or the vegetables you eat, any plants you cultivate, any plants you have in your lawn, if you have a lawn. go as broad as you possibly can. Think about the wood that your table's made out of. If you listed all it out, I suspect you'd still be under 100. He's saying that there are well over 1,000 plant species that people were aware of and utilizing in very specific ways in their society. This was a society with extensive knowledge of their environment. And indeed, ethnoecology studies since then across the world have shown that many indigenous societies, although perhaps not to this extreme extent of 1,600 plant terms, but many indigenous societies have very detailed understandings of their landscape, as we would expect of people of the land, of people who have to make a living on the land. That tends to lead to a high degree of knowledge. And there have been many ethnoecology studies since. This is from one in the late 90s by Johnson, Godesfield, and Hargis, Classification and Nomenclature in Wet'suwet'en and Ethnobotany, a preliminary examination. So you can tell ethnoecologies sometimes have kind of boring titles for their papers, but that's okay. They're a lot more scientific about what they do than most anthropologists of the cultural vein. But here's kind of a good example of plant species, English name, and Wet'suwet'en name. And one of the points that they bring up in this reading is that not all species, the Western scientists, I'm using Western here and I kind of hate that term because it homogenizes a huge percentage of the world's population, but I guess I'll just say perhaps settler scientists, laboratory-based scientists, maybe just federal scientists because they're often associated with the government. Anyways, the terminology, the Linnaean terminology, the species genera terms like viburnum edule, right, the way that scientists classify these species. The Wet'suwet'en society has terms for the vast majority of these plant terms and occasionally even has multiple terms for a single species. So that's been a finding of ethnoecology, is that very often they map on really well local terminology and scientific terminology. They use different words but identify the same things. Sometimes they differ. Often when they differ, it's sometimes because the local, as they sometimes call it, the folk taxonomy or the ethnoecology is sometimes less specific, but a lot of times it's actually more specific. They have more specific categories than sort of a scientific catalog might, because they're recognizing different kinds of variations in it. What we would think of as a single plant species, they're recognizing kind of different variants of it. So fascinating stuff. Some big insights we have from ethnoecology as a whole. Each society has a way of understanding its environment. Indigenous societies and other non-industrialized societies are not sort of environmental simpletons, but instead have detailed knowledge about their landscapes. They may categorize very, very differently sometimes than Western science might. Sometimes things get placed into categories that are not the ones that might naturally occur to a biologist working in a laboratory. So for example, in the Tanakh and what Christians call the Old Testament, there's sort of an implicit category of like flying things where both insects and birds go into. Typically we would not in Western science categorize those as the same things, right? There's more precise terminology as well. This was just one example within that society. But people understood the diversity. They may have clumped it differently, but they understood the diversity, right? And it worked for their purposes. And so people may categorize differently, but they do have categorical systems, and those systems tell us a great deal. By the way, I just thought this would be interesting. There's no real specific point I want to make here, but these are just a few Dena'ina names, since we're on Dena'ina land, for different animal people in our area, such as Kunchi for beluga whale, Idashla for wolverine, there's Kanchi for porcupine, Gushka for cat, for brown bear, which is also a grouping term for mammal, Shluka for salmon, which is also used as a broader term for fish, and so forth. You can see these terms if you live here on the peninsula. You can see these terms if you go to Salteshi Trail. A lot of the trails are named in as an animal, and then they'll also have on the sign the Dena'ina name for the animal. Also, if you go to the municipal park here in Soldana, the Soldana Creek Park, there's some signs with Dena'ina animal names on them. Interesting stuff. I love it. So that's ethnoecology in a nutshell as a way of understanding how cultures view the world, and it's a very valuable body of work, and it's taught us a lot of things and corrected a lot of misconceptions about that were held in the early and mid-late 20th century, where oftentimes indigenous people were viewed as sort of irrational or less efficient users, and that Western scientists sort of needed to come in and tell them how to farm or tell them how to do this. And ethnoecology was one of the first big pushbacks, at least one of the big first pushbacks amongst other people from settler societies to say that's not really the case, right? Like, people have detailed ways of living in their landscape. That's how they've survived for centuries, if not millennia. One critique that can be made of ethnoecology is that many people have made is that it is very focused on cognitive categories and language categories. There's some problems with that. One of the problem is categories enough to really understand a worldview? And the answer is probably not in most cases. So we talked a minute ago about Wet'suwet'en plant terminologies, but does knowing how Wet'suwet'en people call a water lily or a cranberry or a spruce and the different terms they have for different kinds of spruce, does that help you understand this? Does that help you understand the major rail and street blockades held by Wet'suwet'en people and their allies in response to oil sales that they were not properly consented on that were occurring a couple of years ago, and I think are still ongoing in some areas? Wet'suwet'en blockades as a political movement to protect native lands and to assert native land rights and consent over native lands cannot be understood just by understanding sort of categories of classification of plant species. Instead, you'd have to consider political histories, understandings of colonialism, understandings of land as symbolic of an indigenous identity, as well as spiritual concepts of the land embedded within Wet'suwet'en society. So ethnoecology is not the be-all, end-all of understanding environmental worldviews, but it is one piece of the puzzle and a very interesting one. The other problem is a more methodological one, and that's this. Just because people can group species into certain categories when an annoying anthropologist is prodding them to, doesn't mean that's actually the categories that they think with, right? So we have to be careful to not construct interviews in ways that we're prodding people to make associations and categories that they wouldn't normally make. If I forced you to, I could get you to list the several dozen kinds of bird species that you know, and I could say, okay, make a bunch of categories, and you're going to have like birds of prey and songbirds and stuff, and then I could say, okay, well, make categories for the songbirds. And unless you are super into bird watching like your cool professor, the categories you make for songbirds would probably be kind of BS. They might be kind of BS categories if you don't know much about birds, right? You might be lumping things in a way that's not entirely logical, nor what you would normally do. It's just you're like under pressure to make it into categories because somebody's forcing you to. Not forcing you to, but asking you to. So it's important to not take these things without a grain of salt. But generally speaking, I think ethnoecologists try to avoid that problem and do find really interesting information. Ethnoecology, by the way, kind of paves the way for, it's starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it's trying to give a sense to social sciences that indigenous people really, and other peoples really do have detailed understandings of their environment, which then paves the way for kind of a bigger, more holistic concept that we call traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. It's a concept that you will definitely hear used in government environmental circles on occasion, oftentimes with the implication that the government wants to more meaningfully include TEK into things like co-management or land management regimes. That's been critiqued sometimes. Paul Nadasdy, who studied this quite a bit, he talks about sort of the TEK cottage industry, the idea that sometimes government scientists, they talk a mean game about integrating TEK, and they'll do it on a surface level, but it doesn't fundamentally, right, they might kind of use some of these concepts in how they talk about a landscape or the signs they put up or something, but they don't actually change how they manage the land. It's just sort of being taken in on sort of a surface level. Another paper talks about this as wallpaper. People sometimes get fixated on the wallpaper and don't go any deeper, because going deeper would actually challenge how you're managing the landscape and bring up tricky questions like, should a park actually be fenced off, or should it instead be returned to the indigenous people who originally inhabited there? So TEK has had its critiques, but nonetheless it's an important body of scholarship to be familiar with. So TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, is kind of the child of ethnoecology. It really starts up in the 70s and 80s with the work of scholars whose names you don't need to remember, such as Robert Johannes, and working on Pacific Islander fish knowledge, or Fikret Burks working on knowledge of caribou and fur species in Southeast Canada. With Cree people, he wrote and so these scholars and many others started bringing up the fact of this extensive body of knowledge that people in indigenous and other societies had, not just about categories of species, but more generally of sort of how their environment works, that people had models for how their ecosystems worked and what the ecosystem processes were and what nature was like and how it acted. And in the 1980s, people started to become very interested in this on a number of fronts. So obviously the general public found this interesting, and you started to see more books about it, but you also had a lot of policymakers who got interested in it, partly because a lot of Western quote-unquote international development things like going into a nation and saying, we'll give you a loan of money, but you need to adjust your farming practices to be more efficient, in our view, many of those sort of development schemes had sort of failed or not done very well. Some had done really, really well, such as some of the Green Revolution 2 things, but some of them had not done very well. Some sort of conservation / agriculture kind of culture change attempts that had been made by groups like the World Bank or the UN. And so TEK was kind of seen as a pushback to say, one of the reasons this is probably not doing very well is because Western scientists or scientists trained outside of the country in question may have like this much knowledge about the local environment, where indigenous people who have been there for generations, for millennia, have this much knowledge. We should really be talking to them when we try to tell them, quote unquote, how to use their land. And even if we are going to prescribe some kind of changes or maybe a technology that might be useful, it should start from the ground of, hey, you already actually know a ton about your environment. Can you please help us understand where this technology might be useful, as opposed to just coming in there and assuming that you understand the ecosystem dynamics, which you very well may not. So TEK was an acknowledgement of that, an acknowledgement of that when you have a society that's occupied a space for generations, that knowledge is passed down and accumulated and added upon generations by generations. People make observations of how the animals and the plants and the other organisms around them act. They make observations of what the typical weather patterns are, often very detailed observation, and that becomes part of a sort of storehouse of knowledge that gets passed down and added to generation by generation. It's defined in the reading that you did by Hun et al. As detailed, empirically, and experientially grounded knowledge of local plants, animals, and places. I want to focus on that empirical side of it. Sometimes it becomes very hard to not just say science and indigenous knowledge. You saw that in the Robin Wall Kimmerer book, where she drew a distinction between traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge and scientific ecological knowledge. And we have to draw these binaries sometimes because we're trying to paint a picture of two different kinds of knowing the landscape. But as one of my mentors, Don Grindy, points out, it sometimes does a disservice because it implies that indigenous people aren't doing science, right? But in reality, indigenous peoples, prior to the arrival of sort of lab-based science into their communities, are doing trial and error experiments with things in their environment, right? So for example, is Quechua-speaking Peruvians, indigenous Peruvians, that research shows do extensive sorts of experiments with potato farming. This year we're going to plant the potato a little bit further up the hill and see what that gets us, or this year we're going to try a slightly different kind of potato and see how that turns around. People are doing experiments, whether or not they call it that, and adding to the cultural storehouse of knowledge that their society has about ecology. Fikret Burke says TEK is, quote, a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief. Notice that it is not just the knowledge, but it's how people use the knowledge and how they believe about the landscape, the values they attach to it. Evolving by processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission. That can happen a lot of ways. It can be culturally transmitted by one person telling another person, hey, here's when the salmon are usually running. Or as in the example from the Hun reading, it can be passed down by a Tlingit parent telling their Tlingit kid, like, hey, when we harvest gull eggs, don't take the gull eggs when there's 3 eggs in the nest because the mom has stopped laying eggs. Instead, only take gull eggs when there's 1 or 2 eggs in the nest because she'll repopulate the nest, but not if it's up to 3, right? People sometimes just out and out pass that stuff on to their kids or to other people in their community. Other times it's more of a tacit knowledge that you pick up by going hunting or foraging or fishing with people, and they pass it along to the younger people in the community. And sometimes it's something that's embedded in stories. By the way, there's other kinds of terminology that get used to talk about TEK. Local knowledge, traditional knowledge, place-based knowledge, indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge and TEK are not precisely synonymous for a number of reasons. One of which is that TEK doesn't necessarily have to be indigenous knowledge, right? A group of people could occupy a space for generations despite not being indigenous to the landscape. Think back to the case study we talked about a week ago about rooibos farmers in South Africa that were Afrikaner or Euro-American or Euro-African descent. They obviously aren't indigenous to that space and in fact come from colonizing populations, but they'd been in the space long enough that they have a certain amount of accumulated knowledge about how rooibos operates in that landscape. So TEK doesn't have to be indigenous knowledge, although sometimes those terms kind of get used interchangeably. There's also group-specific terms like Inuit Kwajimajatukanggit, which my NUPI is not great, but that's a term that was used in some Canadian studies for Inuit TEK. I'm going to share a couple of examples of TEK studies. So TEK oftentimes, as I was saying before, sometimes it's TEK studies, sometimes this is used as a theory or a paradigm just for sort of general studies by academics or by scientists just to better understand indigenous communities, better understand landscapes. And that's certainly something that gets done. A lot of times, though, TEK is used in kind of an applied context by scientists that work for the government or by people who are academics, but they're writing up their research for policy reasons. They want it to affect policy, to show like, here's a different way of viewing this landscape from local people that can inform and help us better preserve and sustain this landscape. So a good example of that is the research that was done by Eugene S. Hunn, Daryl Johnson, Priscilla Russell, and Thomas Thornton, the latter of I can't say necessarily about Eugene Hunn and Daryl Johnson, but Priscilla Russell and Thomas Thornton are both well-known names in Alaskan anthropology. But they did research on Glacier Bay National Park in southeast Alaska on Tlingit practices related to gull eggs. And they actually have a much bigger paper that I think I also put up as an optional reading, but this shorter paper gets most of the points across. That basically that gull egg harvesting in that national park had over time been outlawed, but that previously Tlingit people had definitely been harvesting gull eggs from glaucous-winged gulls, this guy over here, and they'd been harvesting from them for food, and that people had a very specific knowledge of gull nesting behavior. That gulls, glaucous-winged gulls have an interesting kind of nesting where basically it's kind of a what's that word? Critical mass sort of approach to nesting. There's a more scientific term for it, but that's basically what it is. Once they get up to 3 eggs, they stop laying. But if they only have 1 or 2 eggs, they keep laying. But once they get up to 3, basically certain hormonal processes in the mother gull turn off and she stops laying more eggs. So elders would tell kids, like, hey, when you go out gull egg harvesting, if you see a nest with 3, leave it be. Right? But if you see a nest with 1 or 2, go ahead and harvest, and then the mama gull will lay more eggs. Of course, that has 2 great impacts, one of which is that it keeps the egg production going if you want to go back to the nest at some point. The other thing, though, and probably more to the point, is that it keeps the gull population sustainable. You make sure that you're not unduly affecting the gull population. If there was 3 eggs and you took them, the mom's not going to relay an egg. You've just screwed up the population cycle for that specific gull family. So it's a way of keeping things sustainable. And indeed, that's one of our big findings of TEK, is that very often, long before people showed up with things like wildlife quotas or hunting limits or protected areas, long before that, many indigenous groups had ways of sustaining the animal populations. They may not look the same, they may have different kinds of principles and concepts, they may work to varying degrees, but there was ways that local people had of sustaining those populations. One point that's also been brought up by TEK scholars is that it's sometimes easy for outsider scientists to kind of write TEK off as a spiritual thing, especially certain kinds of TEK. So for example, they were using an example of Labrador, native peoples of Labrador in Canada. In this specific article by James Sky, he was saying, there's these spiritual stories about how geese operate that have to do with how humans respect them and therefore like their behavior of where they'll fly within our area. And he says, it's easy for outsider scientists to write that off as, a sacred, maybe interesting belief system, but that doesn't really reflect how Western scientists understand the flying behavior of swans. But he points out in this reading, like, it's actually a really good way of describing swan behavior. It just happens to give credit to swan agency as spiritual actors, but it is actually an accurate description of the variations in swan flying patterns year by year. So his point is with sometimes the fact that something's put in a different sort of phrasing than Western science or laboratory science doesn't mean that it's not a perfectly accurate description on the ground of how things tend to play out. There's some specific things we've learned from sort of 30 to 40 years of TEK scholarship. One of them is that TEK in societies often that are indigenous or have long held an area, TEK tends to be very, very specific, especially for the parts of the environment that are most useful to human beings, but not solely those areas. There's also sometimes really detailed TEK about things like butterfly coloration among Quetzal peoples that's maybe not terribly relevant and just interesting to people. But oftentimes TEK is very, very robust, especially on the things that are most relevant. And so, for example, among Innu people in Canada, in Arctic Canada, very precise characterizations of how lake ice works. I got ocean ice. I should have gotten lake ice for this picture, but of how lake ice works and the different stages of how ice forms on a lake. As for us as Alaskans, we understand that not all ice is the same when it comes to a lake, and there's varying degrees of thickness and slushiness and different things, and some of it you can walk on, and some of it you definitely shouldn't. And also it affects waterfowl behavior in different ways, and you can look at the sea ice and get a pretty good prediction. If you're an Innu person in the Arctic, you can get a pretty good prediction of when waterfowl are going to show up and start hanging out and being around your area based on what the lake ice is doing. And so much more precise terminology than what a lot of us would have. I would typically just call it thin ice or thick ice, right? There's other examples as well. Among some Nevadan tribes, this was a study by Fowler called Just Like a Garden, and they found that some Native American tribes in Nevada had really, really, really detailed knowledge of the different plants that they were foraging from, and they referred to it as just like a garden, which I thought was interesting, kind of like we know these plants, we know them well, and potentially even in many cases, you have foraging groups who were intentionally harvesting in such a way that the plant would be able to keep reproducing, or even relocating some of the seeds and things in sort of a way that was almost like horticulture more, where you were kind of intentionally putting certain favored plants in certain areas. So very precise kind of knowledge. TEK often also has very extensive temporal depth, and what I mean by that is that by virtue of it having been passed down through generations, indigenous peoples oftentimes have knowledge of the landscape that goes back decades, if not centuries, if not occasionally millennia. So a good example of that is the book Do Glaciers Listen by Julie Cruikshanks. She spent a lot of time with Tlingit as well as Canadian Athabascan peoples, listening to their stories, elder stories about glaciers. And what she found was that in these traditional stories, some of which were certainly couched in and explained through a spiritual worldview, it told stories about how the glaciers had retreated over time as a result of warming patterns in the area, or advanced over time. And so that knowledge going back hundreds of years had been preserved in people's oral storytelling. Another study showed that Inuit people, I think this was another Canadian study, you can see that Canadians have done a ton of TEK research, as have Alaskans, that Inuit people have, that there was Inuit groups that had been studied where they had sort of decades-long knowledge of the ups and downs of caribou population that was very, very detailed. And you can see from there some of the practical utility of why some people are interested in TEK within the government, because there's a knowledge of how the environment has acted over time that you would have to be around for 50 or 100 years to gain, but that scientists haven't been around that long, but indigenous people have, and they've been paying attention, and they can tell us important things when we're government scientists, or better yet, it can be indigenous people themselves crafting the research and the research priorities based on their own knowledge. Or, for example, Fikret Burks' studies of Cree and the knowledge of sort of long-term population cycles among prey mammals. By the way, Sacred Ecology is kind of a foundational book in TEK studies by Fikret Burks. I strongly recommend it. It'll just give you a gajillion more examples of what I'm talking about here. And yes, gajillion is a scientific term. It's used by my 6-year-old, therefore it's a scientific term. Some other facets of TEK that in some ways contrast maybe with the way that settler science is often done is that it is oftentimes contextualized in a broader moral framework and relational framework, and sometimes, yes, supernatural or spiritual framework. So a good example is the reading that you did from Boris and Knott, that traditional ecological knowledge among indigenous cultures of the Nushagak and Kvichak watersheds, Alaska, that quote where it was talking about the people that they would eat wild celery and have these delicious meals off them, but then they were told by the elders to take all the leaves and skin and everything off that plant, take it out in the river, throw it in, and they would ask why this fresh salad plant and the skin will meet with the salmon and let the salmon know that they're already good to eat and they need to hurry up and come because we are hungry. So the idea found in many societies, including Yupik and Dena'ina societies, the idea of sort of animals in as certainly within Dena'ina society, the idea of animals often as agents, as sentient, and as choosing to be fished or hunted, choosing to put themselves in that zone. So for example, amongst Shukpiak or Alitik people with traditional whaling patterns, which of course now are no longer in effect, but traditionally the idea that if you had a portrait of a whale that you had drawn and you put it at the bottom of your kayak, that if it was a good portrait, the whales would feel respected and therefore come close to your kayak or your bidarka so that you could spear the whale. That the whale was sort of an active process in its own hunting, that it was choosing to give its life to people that were respectful. We'll talk more about that in later lectures, but the point I'm trying to make here is that TEK oftentimes maps onto Western science, or it sort of extends it, right, by telling it about things that wildlife biologists haven't been around to observe the last 200 years, and so oftentimes TEK rounds out that narrative. But it oftentimes also expands it into territory that settler science may or may not be very comfortable with, including into spiritual realms, into moral realms, where animals are agents and where there's a social connectedness and a relationship and certain ritual or ceremonial or moral practices that have to be followed for animals to return, which is very different than the idea of so long as we set the right hunting limit and protect the right lands, the animals will return. The final point I want to make about TEK is that TEK is often embedded, and this is kind of related to the last point, TEK is often embedded in sacred narratives, or just in narratives, period. They don't necessarily have to be religious stories. So a good example of this, there's a story about coyote among Zuni people in New Mexico. And in that story, Coyote keeps asking this bird, Junco, it's like a little graybeard bird, you've probably seen Juncos before anyways, keeps asking Junco for like help to remember, Junco has a cool bird song and Coyote keeps wanting to learn the song but keeps like tripping and then forgetting the song, so has to go back to Junco and be like, can you tell me that song again? And then gets the song and goes away whistling like, okay, and then trips again and then has to go back because he's forgotten the song again because his train of thought was, messed up when he tripped. And eventually Lady Junco gets really annoyed with Coyote, right? Coyote's often being annoying. And Junco goes behind a rock, goes and hides, and then puts her feathers on top of a rock. And then Coyote goes up to Lady Junco and says, hey, teach me that song again, and Junco doesn't respond because Junco's not Junco. Junco is a rock with feathers on it. And Coyote says, hey, give me that song again. Hey, you better do it. And Junco doesn't respond because Junco is a rock with feathers on it. And then Coyote chomps on Junco, except for Junco is a rock with feathers on it, so Coyote's teeth get messed up. And that's why coyotes have a kind of funky looking dentalia, as you can see in this picture. It's a Zuni way of explaining a observable ecological fact, and that embeds a certain form of traditional ecological knowledge. Whether or not it's meant to be taken literally or is more just a silly story, I cannot say. The person who told me the story, who's not Zuni but spent a lot of time in Zuni communities, he said it was more meant to be lighthearted, but nonetheless, telling that story teaches us something about coyote dental features, does it not? Something that you may not have been aware of. So, oftentimes TEK is embedded within stories. There's another term that gets used, which is Indigenous Knowledge. It's, as I said before, sometimes used synonymously with TEK, for example, by Robin Kimmerer in the reading that you did. It's sometimes used as kind of a bigger term, and the idea is that what we call TEK, what we gather up in studies about Innu sea ice, or about Cree understandings of prey animals, or about Inuit knowledge of historic caribou, is really a much smaller subset of a bigger sort of worldview and framing and sacred understanding of the world, whereas TEK sometimes very much still is proceeding along sort of the priorities of settler science. It's still kind of, okay, you tell us about population trends based on your knowledge, In Indigenous knowledge, it's a concept of let's look at this more in a holistic way from the ground up, right? Let's start from the foundations of how you even approach nature, how we relate to nature, what that even means, what kind of entities, physical, spiritual, whatever the case may be, inhabit nature, and sort of build up a worldview that's more holistic so that we can better understand knowledge, not just as this sort of very specific kind of thing like population cycles, but as a much bigger holistic worldview, which is indeed what it is. As Kim Ashgar and Jordan point out, TEK can often come across as sort of a distillation or an appropriation of TEK or of Indigenous knowledge, whereas Indigenous knowledge is sort of the whole kitchen caboodle. I don't think they use the term kitchen caboodle in that specific article. So my point with all of this is that there are some powerful ways that we speak about knowledge systems and understanding the environment. Each of us kind of give us different angles on what we're looking at. Ethnoecology shows us something a little different than TEK. TEK kind of focuses on something different than social construction. But the point is that there are profoundly different cultural ways of viewing the environment, and that cultures have rich knowledge about their landscapes, knowledge that's worth listening to, and knowledge that helps us understand why different groups of people can behave towards the environment in such profoundly different ways, a theme we'll talk about in much greater depth over the next several weeks.